Hello again. Okay, so we were talking about an EKG readout showing all the electrical signals going on at one time in the heart and how those change over a heartbeat. So you'll have your first wave, your P wave, when your atria are contracting. They're depolarizing, they contract. And then you've got what's called the QRS complex, where the atria are done contracting, so they're going to repolarize and relax. And that signal is going to spread down to the ventricles, and the ventricles are going to contract. And then there'll be a break, and you'll have your T wave where the ventricles repolarize again. Does that make sense? So it's showing all the electrical signal going through the heart. So now let's look more at blood pressure. So the average blood pressure is 120/80. And when we say that, we're saying millimeters mercury. mmHg. So that's how much force is pushed against the blood vessel wall. And we measure that using a sphygmomanometer. That's the blood pressure cuff. And so we'll look at what's happening when you measure it on the next slide. Okay. So when our heart beats, we have higher pressure, lower, right? So what you do with the blood pressure cuff or the sphygmomanometer is you push it until it's blocking all blood flow through the brachial artery. So usually you'll go quite high to make sure that you've cut off all blood flow. And then you listen distally to where you've cut the blood flow off with a stethoscope. So if there's no blood flow there, you shouldn't hear anything, right? And so then you slowly release the pressure in the blood pressure cuff. And at some point, you'll hit that systolic pressure, the higher pressure, the pressure in the vessels when the ventricles are contracting. And so when you get there, as long as the heart is pushing out blood, the pressure is higher and the blood will flow through. So you hear like a poof, 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 where the blood's only flowing through when the heart's contracting, but not relaxed. Those are called the sounds of cord cough. And then you'll keep releasing the pressure in the cuff. And once you hit that diastolic, the lower pressure, you won't hear anything again because now the pressure in the cuff is lower than the blood pressure in your vessels at any time. So it's just moving freely, right? So you don't hear any sounds as you lower the pressure. And once you start hearing sounds, you reach the systolic. So it flows when it's higher, stops when it's less, flows, so poof, 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 poof. And then once you reach that diastolic, the artery's totally open, it's really moving, you don't hear anything again. So it's really important to have a lower blood pressure because the higher the pressure, the more likely you are to have homeostatic imbalances long term. So if you have hypertension or high blood pressure, what will happen over time is that puts more pressure on your heart and your blood vessels and causes more atherosclerosis or plaque formation. So over time, what can happen is you can go into congestive heart failure, where your heart works really hard to pump because it's have all this pressure it has to overcome to get out into the aorta. And so the muscle gets really thick, and then the space gets small. So then it doesn't contract as well and it gets flabby. Okay, now let's move on to the lymphatic system. Oh, that's a funny place for my head. Let's move it down here. Okay, so the lymphatic system is another system of vessels. And unlike blood flow, they don't make a full circuit. They're unidirectional. They only go one way. They go from our body tissues back to the blood flow right before we go into the right atrium. Okay? So that fluid in those vessels is called lymph. And it comes from extra fluid outside the cells. And so anything there gets pushed into the lymph vessels and moves through these lymph nodes where they get filtered, up, through more lymph nodes, and into blood flow. So most of the parts of the lymphatic system are moving the lymph or your lymph nodes, but there are also different organs with lymphatic tissue in there that help the lymph system function. It's closely tied to the immune system because you'll have lots of lymphocytes and macrophages in your lymphatic tissue. So let's look at the functions of the lymphatic system. First, we've got it returns excess interstitial fluid to the bloodstream. So basically, the fluid outside the cells So when blood flow moves through, it loses some of that fluid from the plasma. And over time, if we don't return that fluid, our blood pressure will drop, our blood volume will drop. You can go into hypotensive shock. So we need to make sure that fluid gets returned. About 5 liters a day, which is about as much blood as you have in your body. Other functions, it picks up fats that you've absorbed from your diet in the small intestine and transports them. So there the lymph is fattier, kind of yellowish. It's called chyle, C-H-Y-L-E, and gets those into the bloodstream. And then the big one here, again, we've got lots of white blood cells. The lymphatic system is where we can get those lymphocytes activated and mount a large-scale immune response against anything that's causing an infection. So if you remember, there's 2 types of lymphocytes, B cells and T cells, in our adaptive immune response, which we'll look at more in the next chapter. But those lymphocytes are going to activate the immune response, coordinate it, and they're also going to help attack our own cells that have been infected. And then you'll also have macrophages eating anything foreign that comes through the lymph. So if you have an infection, like a bacterial infection in your hand, you get inflammation there. You increase the blood flow there to get our white blood cells in there. The other thing you're doing is you're getting more fluid. And so as that fluid builds up, it gets pushed in the lymphatic system. So any debris, any foreign pathogens that get pushed into the lymph are going to go through those lymph nodes, get eaten, activate our lymphocytes. What happens if we don't drain lymph? Elephantitis. So there you have a parasite that blocks the lymphatic vessels. Basically, they're just like, they've got just an end, and they've got these little mini valves formed by the cells and collagen fibers. And if those get blocked, lymph stays, no fluid comes in the lymph system, and it just builds up and swells. So here's a picture of what I was talking about with those lymphatic capillaries. And they just start. So excess fluid pressure allows the fluid to become into the lymphatic capillaries. And then those little mini valves slam shut and the fluid can't leave. And now this is going to flow really slowly. So it's not like our arteries pushing blood. It's just a slow flow back. If it's low pressure, what do you think they have a lot of? If you said valves, you're right. Okay. So all around our capillary beds, you'll have lymphatic capillaries, picking up fluids, debris, pathogens, old parts in to get broken down. And so then those are going to merge, and they'll form ducts and then trunks, and they'll come in to blood flow right by your subclavian veins on the right and left side. And as that blood flow moves through, it's going to go into lymph nodes. So the lymph nodes are pretty neat. Almost all of the vessels lead in, and there's very few leading out. So it's like taking 8 lanes of traffic and only giving it 2 exits. And so then it gives all of the lymph in here time to be like stagnant, stay still. So it gives time for those white blood cells to get activated and eat things. And then move through. It can also break down cells. So one of the ways that cancer can spread most easily is through our lymphatic vessels. So if cancerous cells move from tissue, like you'll see breast cancer will go to the first node leading out called the sentinel node, and that's where it would first spread to. Our natural killer cells, our cytotoxic T cells would attack those though, and normally they would break it down, but sometimes those cells will divide and cause tumors to form that can be malignant. And I always think it's really interesting. Look at where we've got, well, probably not the best color for this slide, lots of lymph nodes. Our inguinal region, our axillary, our cervical. Okay. All the lymph from our arm is going to go past the armpits. From our head, it's going to drain down. From our legs, it's going to drain up. Right? And then you see lots of lymph nodes in the middle from these organs. Right? So you've got lymph nodes where everything is draining. It's really efficient. And that lymph is going to go through several lymph nodes and get well filtered before that fluid returns back to blood flow. So those are the vessels. Now let's look at some other organs. So other organs include the spleen. So here's our spleen in purple. It's actually got two types of tissue in there. The spleen has white pulp with white blood cells and red pulp with red blood cells. So it has two functions. So white blood cells, immune response, right? And then red pulp with red blood cells, we break down old red blood cells here. Break down old red blood cells. The spleen is highly vascularized. The splenic artery is large, leading into the spleen. And that makes sense, considering we want to break down old red blood cells, we want to filter our blood, right? I want to show you pictures. So there's the splenic artery, and then here is a damaged spleen. One of my old students, her friend was in a motorcycle accident and didn't go to the hospital for several days. They were very lucky because they could have died from blood loss. You can see all the clots in here. And their spleen was removed. So you can live without the spleen. The liver, other organs can take over a lot of its functions. But you'll have a slightly decreased immune response there. Okay, and the other gland we have here is the thymus. So let's use a different color. Yeah, let's go for some orange. So the thymus is bilobed. I'm circling it in orange. It is where we train in our T lymphocytes. So those are the ones that coordinate the immune response, attack our own cells. The B cells mature in the bone marrow. So your thymus is very active in youth. It's really important to get those cells trained in properly. There's two parts there. They make sure that they can attack and bind to antigens, foreign materials, and that they don't attack ourselves. They have self-tolerance. If they're not trained in well, if you don't get exposed to a lot of different things when you're little, you can have autoimmune diseases where your body attacks itself. So let kids play in dirt, be exposed to vast microbiomes. Okay, so next we'll have different organs where you have some lymphatic tissue. Some of these lymphatic follicles with our lymphocytes and our macrophages. The first we have here are our tonsils. There's 4 sets that go around your pharynx or your throat. Okay. Linguinal at the base of the tongue, pharyngeal or adenoid, palatine at the back of your palate, and you also have tubal inside the tube leading to your ear. So those filter food and air. And just like the spleen, you can live without it, but your immune response might be a little delayed. Next, we've got our Peyer's patches. So those are going to be in the distal end of our small intestine. And then you'll have the appendix, the first part of our large intestine. And that makes a lot of sense because you'll have this whole microbiome of gut microbes, right? And we don't want that to get into other parts of our system. So there you'll have immune response. And then our red bone marrow is where we train in those white blood cells, where we make our blood cells. The end.